Hi, my name is Carmen Florez, and I'll be presenting on Brazil, a country that although it is not my country of origin, it is near and dear to my heart. Brazil is a Latin American country located in South America, taking up most of the continent, and is actually the fifth largest country on Earth, based in geographical size. With a population of over 206 million people, it is also the country with the largest population of Portuguese speakers, as a result of it being colonized by Portugal up until 1822. Being such a large country, it is comprised of various ecosystems and geographical regions, as well as cultural regions, with the majority of its Afro-descendant population living in the northeast of the country, something we'll talk more about later. Speaking of Afro-descendant population, Brazil is a very racially diverse country, with 47.7% of its population identifying as white, 43.1% as pardo or mixed, 7.6% as black, 1.1% as Asian. Brazil actually has the largest population of Japanese people outside of Japan, and 0.4% native. In Brazil, they speak Portuguese, a beautiful language I've been learning for about 9 years now, which comes from Portugal, who colonized Brazil back before the 19th century. Brazil was Portugal's only territory in the Western Hemisphere, as a result of the Treaty of Tordesillas. This is something that makes Brazil different from the rest of Latin America. Most of Latin America speaks Spanish, since they were mostly all colonized by Spain. As a result, this creates a small divide in Latin America, due to some sometimes minimal but pretty significant language barriers, and even culture barriers. Like I mentioned, Brazil was colonized by a completely different country, and therefore had a different colonization experience. Brazil was actually the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, something that has clearly had a negative lasting effect on race relations in Brazil. The size of the country is also something that differentiates it from the rest of Latin America. As the largest country in Latin America by both size and population, it is composed of many different regions differing in everything from ecosystems to culture, which creates a huge divide in the country, also results in an insane amount of income inequality. Brazil is actually one of the countries in the world experiencing the largest amount of income inequality. Brazil's size, however, can be seen as a positive when taking into account the natural and agricultural significance of the country. Brazil is recognized as part of BRIC, a set of countries, Brazil, India, Russia, and China, who demonstrated the most potential for economic growth in the 21st century. This presented Brazil in a positive light as a potential economic powerhouse. Enough with the differences. Brazil can be considered similar to the rest of Latin America because of the similar history and culture. Like other Latin American countries, Brazil was once colonized and is now very mixed race and comprised of many different subcultures, with influences from African slavery, native traditions, European heritage, and a large influx of international immigrants. I chose to focus my case studies on some of the things that interested me the most about Brazilian culture, the first being the United States intervention during the 1964 coup d'etat. Brazilian politics is complicated, especially the 20th century, where the country went through decades of uncertainty, dictatorships, military intervention, and more. Not to anyone's surprise, the United States chose to get involved in 1964. President John F. Kennedy had already been orchestrating the involvement, but was replaced by President Lyndon B. Johnson after Kennedy's death. The coup aimed to overthrow President João Goulart by members of the Brazilian armed forces, and the United States provided arms and other supports for the military coup plotters, such as motor oil, gasoline, and ammunition. The coup was nicknamed Operation Brother Sam and aimed to stop President Goulart from becoming too friendly with anti-American radicalists. With help from the CIA, the United States worked with the U.S. ambassador in Brazil, Lincoln Gordon, and they were able to successfully overthrow President Goulart and receive support from the Brazilian Congress. Such coup led to a military regime that was aligned with U.S. expectations and led to a lot of backwards thinking in Brazil. It wasn't until 1985 that Tancredo Neves was elected president of Brazil and the dictatorship was over. I focused another one of my case studies on overcoming colonial legacies of race and ethnicity, specifically the mistreatment but also exploitation of Brazil's Afro-descendant population. Police brutality is a huge issue in Brazil, with violence being rampant, as well as police corruption, leading to a huge wave of anti-police protests and Brazil's own version of Black Lives Matter. Nevertheless, Brazil continues to exploit their Afro-descendant population and use their African culture as a way to attract tourists. Examples of this are samba, a dance, capoeira, a martial art disguised as a dance, and candomblé, an African-based religion. Things that were once banned and illegal in the country, but now serve as Brazilian icons and are recognized around the world. Samba was banned by the government because they believed it tarnished Brazil's image, since it was related to the marginalized Africans who lived in Brazil after the abolishment of slavery. Something similar happened with capoeira, that was also banned because the government believed that after slavery was abolished, the former slaves would use capoeira, a martial art disguised as a dance, to band together and revolt. Candomblé, of religion, was also banned because it was associated with the poor and dispossessed communities that existed after the abolishment of slavery in 1888. These three traditions were eventually recognized and brought back, but the damage was done. They were marginalized and made illegal, but now they're celebrated as a way to exploit Afro-Brazilians and attract tourists around the world. I've included a video example of capoeira because it is a cultural and historical tradition that I find extremely interesting. Throughout history, African slaves would practice capoeira set to the tune of drums and other instruments in order to pretend that it is a dance and fool their slave owners into thinking they were just practicing their cultural traditions. Instead, capoeira was a martial art, and they were using this as a way to train in order to revolt or protect themselves from the dangers that came with being slaves. I've included a video example of capoeira because it is a cultural. I did my last case study on the public health concerns and epidemics, focusing on the Zika virus, an epidemic I remember very clearly. The Zika virus is a mosquito-transmitted disease that is basically the flu on steroids and is dangerous to those who aren't able to treat the symptoms in time and pregnant women, for Zika can develop microcephaly in their unborn fetuses. In the early 2010s, the Zika epidemic was widespread and scared a lot of people because of the facility of it being transmitted, as well as the negative effects it had, especially on pregnant women. For a while, people were scared of traveling to Brazil and even South America as a whole, especially during the 2016 Olympics, out of fear of contracting the Zika virus. Nevertheless, Zika was not as dangerous as it was portrayed to be, and the main concern was the low-income populations that were affected the most as a result of inadequate living conditions where mosquitoes thrive and are more likely to transmit diseases. And the populations were less likely to receive adequate medical treatment and suffered the most, which of course resulted in death. The problem with countries like Brazil, and especially these low-income populations, is that diseases that aren't that big of a deal are incredibly dangerous and even lethal because they don't have the medical treatment necessary to combat them correctly. In conclusion, Brazil is a developing nation with a large amount of potential. However, as a result of its internalized disadvantages, such as a corrupt government, inadequate health care, and institutionalized racism, it is falling behind. As much as its economy works to improve, its society remains stagnant and even retrogrades in terms of improving income and racial equality, as well as the quality of life of their citizens.